probably a good idea to give you some kind of a foundation for what we're talking about here in terms of critical thinking and communication. And so I wanted to put a few things together here and harking back to some classical theory or philosophy on this whole idea of communication and critical thinking and rhetoric. Um, Rhetoric is one third of the old trivium put together by Aristotle, the trivium being grammar, logic, and rhetoric. Um, and rhetoric really it's the art of using language as a means to persuade, to change somebody's mind. And as natural as you and I might think that is, it's actually a skill. It's an art. It's something that, um, if you take a look at current media, it's something that we're not doing anymore. That's something that seems to have died away in what's going on. So, and we're persuaded on levels now that are much more elementary and easy than we were before because I think we've lost our sense of cynicism, our sense of questioning what's going on. Persuasion is a motivational or an ideological impetus to change thought. It's the very vehicle by which an argument is achieved, what we're trying to do with this class. The problem with persuasion, though, is that it doesn't seem to work all the time. People still aren't fastening their seatbelts. People are still smoking cigarettes or still uh, eating a lot. And what's happening here, perhaps, is there's not that powerful connection between logic and proof. Rhetoric is a tool. Okay, it's an instrumental communication that's devised to the end of reaching social change, but that change requires proof in order for logic to happen. Now, Aristotle taught that proof happens on three different levels. In order to truly move an audience, the rhetoric that we're using to move that audience had to involve a method of connecting to the audience. And we do that through emotion, what we call pathos. We connect with an audience on terms of how they're feeling. I put this image up of my spouse because I can think of no other outside of my own children, no other person out there that gives me such an intense feeling of connection, an intense feeling of satisfaction and pride there. So that's what that represents to me. The second area of proof is what happens to us logically. Okay, what happens to us in terms of being able to make some kind of sense. And that's important to us as well because that's a proof that appeals to the mind, where the pathos proof appealed to the heart. This the logos appeals to the mind. If we can put both of those together, if we can make proofs happen on how we think and how we feel, then we're going to get somewhere. Then we become more persuasive. And that's important when we're trying to go through and figure out an argument. The third area of proof here is what was what is called ethos. And while it is a subtext or a root, an etymology of the word ethics, and it can be maybe remembered that way, it's much more than that. Ethos is an idea of credibility. Now, I'm not trying to be narcissistic here and putting an image up of myself. My point here is if you don't believe what it is that I'm saying, then I lack ethos. I've lacked the credibility. But because I'm a professor and I've studied these things, I have that credibility. Hopefully, I have that ethos. And that ethos becomes a proof in and of itself as well. And for some people, that proof is unfounded because we take a look at their charisma or perhaps their eloquence instead of looking at maybe the foundation or um, the proof of what it is that they're talking about. Now, Aristotle also held that there are common ideas, that there are values that give us motivation, some kind of reason to respond based on how we feel, how strongly we're connected, how thoroughly we're convicted or convinced. And it's through these appeals that we resonate with certain messages and certain rhetoric. And all of this results in some level of persuasion. And sometimes that's done ethically, and sometimes that's done without us even knowing about it. So persuasion is an attempt to convince in our heads and to motivate in our hearts, um, while adapting a persuasive message to all the context of the delivery of what's going on. The trick here is, and what we're trying to learn throughout this class, is how to create and evaluate rhetoric. We have to be aware of what's going on a level that transcends its content. We have to look and see how does that work to get us to think differently, to change our mind about something, or how does that work to get us to feel something differently. And that takes a critical process. At Dixie State's last commencement, just a few weeks ago, it was noted that the number one skill employers are looking for, and yet are finding few people who can deliver this, is that concept of critical thinking. It's the reason you're here. It's the skill that you must develop and hone. It's the asset that you will use to be successful, thinking for yourself, searching out your own truth with the open mindedness to see if it makes sense, if it endures your crisis of faith, and if it does not, why not? The critical thinker considers the sources. Where is this information coming from? Not to be blindsided or just to naively take in anything that's being presented to them. Kind of sounds like social media, right? That's what a lot of people are doing. Social media, in fact, has dumbed us down in that respect, to where we're no longer considering the source. We just think that, well, if it pops up on a social media feed, then it must be true, and that's not the case. The critical thinker identifies assumptions, and we're all making those assumptions. And those assumptions really are based on what we might assert, what we might feel, but there's very little proof or fact behind those things. The critical thinker judges the quality of the argument. Does their claim, is it backed up by the premise of their claim? Is it backed up by evidence? Do they have a solid warrant or reasoning behind what it is that they're arguing? Or is it simply based on assertion and opinion? The critical thinker develops and defends positions, even though they might not agree with that position. They have the ability to go through and to start to take a look at platforms that might build up to establish some kind of position. And in order to do that, the critical thinker asks questions. More than giving answers, they're looking for the questions, they're building questions that start to search out all the aspects of their inquiry, what it is that they're trying to find. In my lower division classes, when I meet my students face to face, I'm always at the very first sentence out of my mouth at the beginning of every class is, what's the burning question today? What's on your mind? The critical thinker experiments. They design. I do this in class often. I experiment a lot with my curricula. When I'm speaking to groups, I try to experiment by involving different methods of engagement with them. As I look at certain arguments that are coming across the board, either through pundits on traditional media or through social media, I'm going to go through and see if I can prove them out through different ways. So it's creative. There's something that a lot of people don't understand is that critical thinking is very creative in that respect. The critical thinker looks for meaning, and that has to happen in context. And there's another video that addresses that concept of context. Meaning exists in context, in the psychological, physical, social, cultural, and temporal ideas. Those contexts that come together, they create meaning for us, and the critical thinker has the ability to identify how those contexts are working. The critical thinker is open-minded. That's what being provisional means. They have the ability to keep their brains from snapping shut when they disagree with what it is that they might be confronted with. They have the ability to go through and say, okay, I see that, I don't agree, but I'm going to go through and think about that at least, and see what I can do maybe to either prove it or disprove it, as the case might be. The critical thinker knows what's going on. They're well informed. They have an idea of what the ramifications are of certain decisions that are being made on their behalf politically, or in terms of foreign policy or economically. We're all connected on some level, and the critical thinker has that ability to gather information to maintain that level of being well informed. And lastly, the critical thinker concludes, they come to a conclusion and perhaps develops an argument with care and time. Uh, this kind of thinking isn't something that is efficient. It's not something that we rush to do. It's something that requires us to go through and take our time with. And once we've gathered what we feel is comprehensive, or at least as much evidence and information as we possibly can, the critical thinker at that point might come to a conclusion.